Okay, can I now call on Peter, there you are, Peter Castellas. He's the CEO of the Carbon Market Institute, peak business association for assisting Australian business in meeting challenges and opportunities in the transitional low-carbon economy. Prior to working with the CMI, Peter was the Director of Carbon Sustainability and Clean Tech in Corporate Finance at Deloitte Touch Tomatsu. Peter Castellas.
Thanks very much, Frank, and thanks for having us here today. It's great to hear the speakers have gone before me, because fair to say it's been a tumultuous period in the wonderful world of climate policy, but the work that people like Erwin and Anna and Anthea consistently put out to provide some hope, optimism and inspiration for people working in this space. And I was thinking last week or the week before, when the intergenerational report came out, when I was a student, Paul Ehrlich came to Australia and spoke to us, and he'd be very disappointed in myself because I've got 5 children in a developing country. But my youngest turned 1 this year, and according to the intergenerational report, he's going to live for 91 years, which means that he's got till 2105. So in 2050 he'll be younger than I am, which is kind of like, this is the time frame which seems very expansive, but in the context of my own family, it's actually quite real and relevant. And in all of that, I think this is the year that I think, you know, as many of you would be aware, there's forces are moving, positive forces, international, domestic, and one of those clearly important audiences to engage and be part of the conversation is the business audience. And I have a fortunate role in the what was potentially a career-limiting move, taking on the Carbon Market Institute a couple of years ago, but I get the opportunity to engage with a really deeply informed membership base, people that have been in this space in different guises, in policy and financial, technical, legal, commercial and community aspects. And with that, the engagement I get to have on a daily basis, both with the membership and with the broader business community, it gives myself and the Carbon Market Institute an opportunity to provide what I would like to describe as sort of a high common denominator, synthesising progressive industry and business thinking as a conduit into government decision making and policy making. So we do a range of things, which include bringing those groups together and interfacing with government, hopefully being constructive and independent and authoritative in terms of dealing with different parts of government and the crossbench and that sort of thing, but also, importantly, trying to tap the sentiment of business as it moves, and it's moving quite quickly. And we've moved from what is a fairly toxic environment, the carbon tax repeal days, to an environment where I'm sort of seeing a little bit more mainstream larger business come out of the climate closet to a degree and start to talk more openly about what are some of the pathways to decarbonisation, what are some of the technology developments that they're looking at, where are their trading partners going. So what I just wanted to share with you today was the results of a survey that we did with Frank and his team here, that looked at just a sort of a snapshot, if you like, of the snapshot of the business thinking. So at the end of last year, we put a survey out to about to a large number of corporates in Australia, and we'd done a fair bit of research on who the decision makers were within those companies. What a very substantial response, about 245 responses, of which more than half were liable entities or heavy industry companies, and the respondents' titles are indicated there in terms of chairmen, but they did cover a broad cross-section of Australian industry. And I'll just share with you some of the key findings that relate to the topic of the day today. In relation to Australia's emissions reduction target to post up to 2020, if I add up the agree and strongly agree, there's about 76% of Australian respondents to the survey said we should have a stronger target than the minimum 5%. If we look at what were the countries that Australia should look to in setting our post-2020 targets in terms of the analysis that's going on that we heard about earlier in the sessions today, no surprises, but China, the EU and the US dominated them, in the order of 80% of respondents indicated that we should be looking at that. But also Japan and India, South Korea, again, these are all in our region. Some of the commercial aspects, and I agree with some of the comments completely before, that it's the domestic policy is very different to the targets. But some of the responses that we got here were quite interesting. When asked whether the climate policy developments in other countries have an impact on Australian business and trade, 80% said yes. Of course, we're in a globally connected economy, and many of the companies that operate and domicile in Australia are either owned overseas, have operations overseas, or institutional owners are in the global capital markets. Whether Australia will be economically disadvantaged if we don't effectively price carbon, 75% have highlighted that they'll be economically disadvantaged if we don't have a carbon price signal in our economy. It's not necessarily what was coming out in terms of business positioning, but under the cloak of anonymity through a survey, it actually is quite revealing. And within that, there were some further questions which I haven't highlighted that Frank had been analysing over the last couple of years, but how many of those companies in a post-carbon tax repeal environment are still pricing carbon within their capital allocation in future investments? And it was over 60%. So yes, we're going to be economically disadvantaged if we don't price carbon. There are risks of adverse implication if our emission reduction targets don't align with key trading partners. So alignment is one thing, and you look at it in a number of ways. It's a pretty high-level statement, but 73% said yes, we will have adverse economic implications. In the domestic policy setting, we are going through the first iteration of the government's policy platform, which is the Emissions Reduction Fund, which is the first auction is in a number of weeks' time, which is to basically fund abatement and allocate that towards our target. The other main policy mechanism, which the design rules are yet to be developed, and although we have the framework in the Carbon Farming Initiative Amendment Bill that was passed last December, the rules around the safeguard mechanism. And now, whatever the consultation paper, which should be out shortly, seeks to get industry's views on, at the end of the day, when we're looking at the design of this, we think from the Carbon Markets Institute point of view, there is a number of things that need to be revisited. How baselines are set, who's covered, how those baselines decline over time, what compliance options do you have in terms of the purchase of domestic or international units, and what penalties should be in place. So we asked some of those questions, again, under that cloak of anonymity. Interestingly, 40 or 50% said that baseline should decline over time, indicating some form of cap that could be put in some ways in terms of limiting emissions reduction in the future that aligns with our future emissions targets. Interestingly, again, the people primarily that would be incurring a penalty under anything, and we can use the penalty when I talk here because we asked about it, and that's 83% of companies surveyed. Bear in mind, many of them are large emitters, of saying that there should be some sort of penalty under this scheme. When looking at what the policy instruments that they suggest might be in play by 2020, there was a range of responses, but again, this isn't going to surprise you, and it does relate to what the UNFCCC task force from the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet is seeking is what are some of those menus of options. So when you look at what, not necessarily what would be preferred, but what respondents think will be in place, renewable energy target, a domestic offset scheme such as the CFI, which we're really pleased has been maintained because some of the stuff that Steve has outlined, carbon forestry is something that could be a very significant part of our emissions wedge in the future, but standards on energy efficiency, support for R&D, market-based mechanisms and standards for power stations. So that combination of subsidies and regulations and carbon pricing signals are all part of what business see as the policy mix that need to be in place. And just a couple of slides to wrap up. The private sector has a role to play in funding emissions reduction. Seems pretty obvious, but it's actually self-selecting here, that over 90% of respondents, or in the order of 90% of respondents, said the private sector has a role to play in funding emissions reduction, and that economic growth for Australia will be increasingly dependent on how well we adapt to a low-carbon world. Again, it was pretty overwhelming in that the recognition, I think, that business in the quiet of their office when they're filling out a survey, and how they communicate that internally, what the role that business plays in engagement going forward in this very critical year for Australia in terms of the design features of our policy of the day, and it may evolve, as we all know, in the future. But where we sit today, the role of business in engaging with and sort of trying to elicit and facilitate these kind of views into government thinking, into policy setting, into target setting process, I think is going to be very important. And we are poised at that position. As I say, just slightly the door of the closet is slightly open, where I think business is starting to feel like it's okay to actually start engaging and have perhaps different views from the lowest common denominator that's been put out through some fora and engagement and lobbying that's gone on over the last couple of years to have a more mature debate. So I'd summarise some of these findings, which we're really keen to keep as an industry body, to keep elevating in things like our National Summit in a few weeks' time and in industry engagement and workshops that we have on an ongoing basis. But some of those findings, Australia needs a mix of appropriate policy instruments. There's no silver bullet, so a mix of those are going to be important. Carbon pricing, Arnie's been in town in Melbourne this last week. Carbon pricing will be back. I won't do his thing, but he's the sort of guy that would actually be able to have some influence in talking to Business Australia because he was so successful in that in California. There needs to be some degrees of alignment with key trading partners on emissions reduction targets. Redefining commercial disadvantage, so it's clear that the government in discussions in international negotiations don't want to disadvantage Australia, and that's been present continuous in international negotiations. But looking at those commercial advantages, where is the technology innovation and the market opportunities in our near neighbours in the low carbon development plans that they have going to take us, and how do we factor that in? The domestic policy response to meet our targets needs to be credible and effective. So if we're going to have a safeguard mechanism, if that's the model that we're going to employ, and that's the government of the day that's bringing that in, let's make sure that that's effective. This is what business is saying. And the private sector recognising its role to carry out the load in that transition. Looking forward to see that action and engaging with in what is anyone in Australia sort of 2 degrees of separation from key decision makers in business and government. And so that, I feel very confident in Australia there's the ability to bring those positive progressive forces in business with the work that's going on in the august bodies that have been presenting today, and with the genuine challenge that policymakers have to actually create a pathway for economic growth in the low carbon world. I think it's going to be a really exciting year. So thanks very much.